childhood, I used to go out and have these adventures through Africa, and it's kind of near and dear to my heart. Even though I don't talk very favorably about South Africa, Africa itself is still always going to be a big part of me. And that's why this particular subject, like I said, really hits close to home. And it's what's happening in Africa with China and what China's doing to Africa. So let's just cut to the chase and talk about what's happening in Africa right now. Africa has always had this sort of corrupt warlord thing going on, dictatorships, governments, including the country I come from, South Africa, always very corrupt and on the take. So they're very easily bought out with money. And this makes things like the environment always take sort of second place to money. And that's where the Chinese succeed very well in Africa, because they can approach these corrupt governments and line their pockets and then just be given access to all of the natural wealth, minerals, animals, plants, trees, etc. So what you're seeing is, in Central Africa, we'll start there, a huge amount of deforestation and logging, things like that. And it's quite detrimental. In fact, I'll show you a quick video. It's taken by an African guy who's very upset about this. So we'll quickly go to that.
I'm in the Zambezi region. Now, when people are talking of timber harvesting, this is what they mean. Look, these are our timber going to China. I'm at the site now. These are timbers going to China. Do we really need to blame the Chinese on this? They got these permits from our Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, to cut these things. Our traditional authorities involved. It's our government, nobody else. Chinese were given these things, and they are taking advantage of our forest. Do we need to blame the government? The Chinese? No. Our country is gone to the dogs. Look at this tree. Diameter of more than 1 meter. Diameter of more than 1 meter. Our country has gone to the cold. This is mostly what is called Zambezi Tikokiata. Okay? It's gone to the dogs. You can segregate the video. These trees take years to replace, and they were cut. Now they have been trimmed to be packed into containers, and it goes to Valdez and then China.
Another big thing, of course, is illegal gold mining. And this is something legal and illegal, but this especially illegal goes on in Africa. You often see they have these big arrests where they go and capture a bunch of sort of illegal Chinese gold miners. So they go there, illegally mine the gold, but in the process they divert river systems, they use a lot of chemicals, of course, for the whole mining process, which is very bad to the local environment. And there are other things as well that happen here. A lot of the illegal immigrants and migrants that go work there, they end up having children with the locals, and then when they're finished and they leave, they just abandon their families, which has become a huge issue. Of course, this is very unfortunate because you get a lot of these abandoned families and they're from very poor rural areas. They've got no way to contact the outside world, and they're kind of just waiting for their Chinese father, to come back. So not only do you get the illegal migrants having children and abandoning their families, and it is a problem. There are news articles all about this in Africa. But you also get the guys who get married for a visa. They get married because obviously it's easier to have a visa, then they can work legally there. But they also kind of at the end of their work, when they've earned what they need to earn, they just bugger off and leave the families alone. And it's a pretty bad problem. Bad enough that it makes the media all the time. Another thing which is a huge problem is, of course, the insatiable hunger for rare animals.
You I don't know who. You kill our animals? No, you see me I still no kill animal. I don't know who is that.
And this one? Who is the owner of this one?
This one same more. They together. I don't know who.
TCM, or traditional Chinese medicine, calls for the use of rare animal parts. In fact, the rarer the animal, the more prized the parts are. So rhino horns, tiger parts, tiger tendons and claws and tiger penises and, weird things like this. Pangolin scales are in huge demand. not only in China, of course, but all over Asia. So Vietnam, Thailand, you name it, because they all have a very similar belief system. The thing is, because the Chinese are very wealthy these days, there's a massive demand. So when you have somebody from a traditional background, let's say, fairly uneducated but very traditional background in China, what will happen is they will grow up with these beliefs that if you have rhino horn or something, it's good for your libido. Then what happens next is they earn a little bit of money, and what do they spend their money on? Well, they're going to spend it on everything that they could never afford. So they spend it on houses, cars, and of course, rare animal parts. And the worst part about it is that there are people out there in Asia that will pay huge amounts of money to be able to eat or use the parts from the last animal on Earth, because the rarer the animal, the more sought after its bits are. Of course, this all plays into the whole corruption that I was talking about earlier. And you very often find, like the Ivory Queen that's just recently been arrested in Africa, who of course knew all the local government people, and she had all of her connections in Guangxi and things like that, and so was able to operate for years and years and years, basically causing the near extinction of certain animals just because they know how to get the supply chain out through Hong Kong into China or wherever they do it. And she can grease the palms of all the local politicians and customs agents and stuff and get it out.
She was the key link between poachers from East Africa and buyers from the Asian countries. So she had a very big network here in Tanzania, in East Africa, in Kenya, and Uganda also.
So it is a huge problem that we have to acknowledge, is that the thirst for these TCM rare animal parts is coming almost exclusively from China these days. Of course, Asia too. And making it illegal is something that you can do, but it's never going to stop the corruption and the bribery and the demand. So until the demand goes away, rare animals, especially in Africa, are at huge risk of extinction. There is one other big thing that's happening in Africa through this whole Belt and Road Initiative. Not only that, but just these huge debt traps. Because the Chinese government right now is putting a lot of money into infrastructure. But it's weird how they do it. They'll approach an African country and say, hey, you guys need railroads, you guys need schools, you guys need highways. We'll build them for you. It's going to be good for your economy. We're also going to inject a lot of money and lend you a lot of money. So of course, that suits the local government very, very well. They accept these terms. And then the Chinese companies come in. But what they do is they end up hiring Chinese laborers from overseas, not local laborers. And if they do, they only hire them a little bit and pay them very little. So this leads to a lot of discontent with the local people in Africa, in these African countries. And it ends up getting the money that's being spent there sent back to China anyway. And then these governments and these countries end up with a huge debt to China. And this is very strategic from China's part, because what they can then do is they can take over the airports, they can take over the strategic ports if there are any seaports there, and they can take over mining, for instance, the mining industries, things like that. And so basically it's a honey trap. They allow the country to get into debt, and then they come in and take what they want. This is a huge problem that's currently facing Africa. Now everybody can agree that the whole sort of colonization of Africa by Europeans and different European nations in the past didn't really come to a very favorable outcome. If you look at Africa today, a lot of it's still in sort of a very chaotic state. You've got a lot of civil war, a lot of starvation, famine, a lot of bad things going on. I mean, that's just the nature of Africa, let's be honest, that's the way it is. But every single time a colony was basically abandoned and left to the locals, it descended into chaos. Now, you can point the blame at the Europeans, you can point the blame at the Africans, it doesn't actually matter. The problem is that now China is basically neo-colonizing Africa. It's basically the same thing all over again.
I think either in Chinese police or the Southern police, the community policing is very beneficial for the whole police work. And we are both of us aware the security in South Africa is not so good as we expect. So with more and more police, local police of South Africa to study Chinese, and they can get along with the local Chinese community, and they can basically understand the Chinese culture, the Chinese language, and easy for them to get along with the Chinese shoppers or Chinese shop owners, and easy for them to carry out their police work.
With Europeans, although they did exploit the land, did terrible things in the past in Africa, they carry a very big guilt, this very big burden of guilt, and that's why you'll see all these sort of charitable organizations sending aid to Africa. You'll see, you know, at least the attempt for reparations. With China, they're pumping money in there, but Africa hasn't dealt with China before, and they don't really understand how China operates. And unfortunately, China is not one of these places that feels charitable. They will take everything from the land, and then they will leave when there's nothing to take, and they will never give anything back. Although I have a lot of fondness and love for China, I don't have any fondness for what China has done to the environment, both in China itself and across the globe. I hope you guys found this informative. I'm not trying to stir hatred here or cause any problems between Africa or China or Europe or whatever it is. I just want to point it out that my African friends are now really feeling the crunch. They're really not happy with what China's doing, and China's extending itself more and more into Africa. And at the end of the day, I think this is going to end very poorly for everyone involved. So until next time, guys,